Welcome to Governing Ourselves, a libertarian atheist podcast. I'm Adam.
And I'm Lisa, and we're here to talk about religion and politics, life, the universe, and everything in between.
Good job, you nailed it.
I know. Man, I keep screwing up. I thought I memorized it, and then I didn't.
Well, to be fair, your part's much harder than mine is. I'm just like, this is my name. Okay, whew, got through it. Good job. Good job, self.
Thank you for your patience.
Who am I? Who am I talking to? Great job. So, how are you doing?
I'm doing all right. Yeah, I'm excited to talk about Chapter 3 in the God Delusion.
Yes. Chapter 3 is, I would say, a lot of the meat and potatoes of the whole book. 3 and 4 together, they pair nicely, like steak and red wine, right? Chapter 3 is arguments for God's existence, which if you ever want to label yourself as an atheist, you will have to, at some point, defend the position that you don't believe in something. Mm-hmm. You may not be able to prove it, but you have to be able to defend yourself, because I think a lot of times the assumption is that you're an atheist, therefore, you're just bad or something, right? As opposed to it being like a legitimate position. There's a lot of assumptions made by theists when you say you're an atheist. Okay, so the God Delusion, Chapter 3, Arguments for God's Existence, opens up with Thomas Aquinas' proofs. Mm-hmm. And the first 3 are pretty much the same thing. Okay, they both deal with this idea of infinite regress, right?
Yep.
So one of the simple ones is the uncaused cost, right? So nothing is caused by itself. Every effect has a prior cause, and again, we are pushed back into regress. This has to be terminated by a first cause, which we call God. So if the universe exists and stuff exists, we assume that before that, less stuff existed, right? Mm-hmm. So even if you go back to the concept of the Big Bang, the natural question after that is what existed before the Big Bang, right? And so religious people would say the infinite regress stops at God.
Yeah.
Now, that's a little different from what Mormonism would teach. Because Mormonism, goes, well, yeah, before God, there was, God's God, right?
Yeah, there were other gods. That the Mormon Church teaches that God, as we know him, the God of the Old Testament, that he used to be a human being just like us. And that soon, or after we die, if you make it to the celestial kingdom, to the highest level, which is exaltation, that you can become a god as well, and that you can create worlds of your own. It's basically just an endless continuation of people becoming gods, creating more people who can then become gods, etc. So
in this case, we also fall into an infinite regress, right? Mm-hmm. Because where does the first God come from? Is there necessarily a first anything? So they all use God as the terminator of the infinite regress.
Yep. And Richard Dawkins says that the people who make these arguments make the entirely unwarranted assumption that God himself is immune to the regress. Right. Which, like we just said, Mormons have an answer for. And then he goes on to say, even if we allow the dubious luxury of arbitrarily conjuring up a terminator to an infinite regress and giving it a name simply because we need one, there's absolutely no reason to endow that terminator with any of the properties normally ascribed to God. Omnipotence, omniscience, goodness, creativity of design, to say nothing of such human attributes as listening to prayers, forgiving sins, and reading innermost thoughts.
Right. And going further, he uses the example of there being a ultimate terminus, right? So he uses the example of gold, right? Or pieces of beef. That if you were to dissect it, a portion in half again and again and again, there is an end point, which is the atom, right? And then if you were to divide the atom, whatever would remain would no longer be beef or gold, right?
Yeah.
It would be something totally different. So here it is. The smallest possible piece of gold is a nucleus consisting of exactly 79 protons and a slightly larger number of neutrons, attended by a swarm of 79 electrons. So that is the Terminator.
Yeah, and he says if you cut gold any further than the level of the single atom, whatever else you get is not gold.
Right.
It's something else now. Yep.
So
that's one of Thomas Aquinas's, arguments. It's basically 3 arguments in one, and it's the idea of infinite regress. He has 2 others.
The argument
from degree,
right,
and the teleological argument, or the argument from design.
Okay. So humans can't judge God because they aren't perfect, but God can. That would be the argument from degree. So
yeah, and Richard Dawkins says that's an argument.
You might as well say people vary in smelliness, but we can make the comparison only by reference to a perfect maximum of conceivable smelliness. Therefore, there must exist a preeminently peerless stinker, and we call him God.
Yeah. Yeah. Richard Dawkins, he's got a few humorous things he says in the book. He's kind of funny sometimes.
Right. There's some zingers.
Yeah, there are.
Now, they are across. nerdy zingers.
Yeah, I like that, though.
So the teleological argument, so you have to, have patience with us because, again, we didn't have fancy names for that stuff. Back in seminary class, right?
No.
We had Moroni's Promise. That's all we had.
Yeah.
The
argument from design.
Yes, the argument from design. Things look designed, therefore they're designed.
Yeah. I would say this one does come up in the Mormon church every now and then. The idea that something is so complex, and we talked about this an episode or 2 ago. But something is so complex, there's no way it could have come about by chance. It had to have been created by a designer. Something designed needs a designer, and that designer is God. And that's what Richard Dawkins covers in this book quite a bit, is that, no, things they don't come about by chance. It's by natural selection. It's by evolution. Things evolve. It's not random.
Right.
It's not between random. I'm going to find that quote really quick because it's really good. But go ahead and say what you were going to say.
Yeah. I think that a lot of people misunderstand when you say things like evolution or natural selection, they think that means random. And while there is some degree of randomness, like whenever another generation is created, it's more, it's far less random than you think. Because yes, natural selection is a completely different process. It doesn't randomly generate offspring. It generates offspring with, properties of both parents, plus a few extra things. And then whoever survives essentially gets to, pass those things on. So.
Yep. And I think you've read The Selfish Gene, right? By Richard Dawkins?
I'm about 75% of the way through.
Okay. He talks about that more there, doesn't he?
A lot more. So if you want the more science-y book, I would say definitely that one.
Okay.
Because like in this book, it's more like why theists are wrong. And I would say like that book is more like, but what is there actually? Right? Even though this book also talks about that to a degree, The Selfish Gene goes much further into like what actually does exist in the material universe, right? So
Okay. Oh, I will definitely have to read that. That sounds fascinating.
it's incredible. And I think between the two books, I think I have to say I actually am enjoying the Selfish Gene a little bit more. But I think that it would be, I think my suggestion for a reader would be to maybe start out with the God Delusion and then move into the Selfish Gene. Because I think particularly if you're like me and you're not really a scientist or anything like that, and you grew up believing in God, so you always took science class with a grain of salt.
Right.
It's a better primer. And so I think that this book helps you read the other book.
Okay. Yeah,
Anyway,
that's good advice.
Did you find your quote?
I did. There are a few of them. So on page, let's see, at the beginning of chapter 4, whether almost certainly is no God, he gives the example of a Boeing 747.
Right.
So, and I did mention that before.
Yeah, last episode, I think.
Yeah. So it says, the odds against assembling a fully functioning horse, beetle, or ostrich by randomly shuffling its parts are up there in the 747 territory. This, in a nutshell, is the creationists' favorite argument. An argument that could be made only by somebody who doesn't understand the first thing about natural selection.
Yes.
Somebody who thinks natural selection is a theory of chance, whereas, in the relevant sense of chance, it is the opposite. And then a little further on page 119, he says, the candidate solutions to the riddle of improbability are not, as is falsely implied, design and chance. They are design and natural selection. Yeah. So that kind of, when you come with the argument that, things had to have been designed, they're so complex. There's no way that this came about by chance. Richard Dawkins is like, you're right.
Yeah.
It didn't come about by chance. It came about by evolution through natural selection.
Right. And there's really not much random about that. It's actually meticulously well designed maybe not even well designed, but it's meticulously designed over a series of many, many, many generations very slowly. It's about as precise as you can get.
Yeah.
Now, whether or not that actually achieves favorable outcomes is different. And so this is not something he really talks about here, but I've heard him and other atheists talk about this, is that there is this concept of unintelligent design, right? There are things that we have evolved that, in my opinion, are sort of proof against a designer, because there are very silly things that exist. For instance, our appendix has some degree of use, but we can live without it, and it may one day explode and kill you. So if I'm a designer, I probably would have skipped that part, and I probably would have, or I would have just made a better appendix. It
wouldn't explode.
My favorite example is the idea, in humans where our food pipe and our windpipe are right next to each other.
Yeah.
This does not exist with all animals. Sometimes they are far away from each other.
Yeah.
And, so this precious child of God who is, exactly designed can choke on a hot dog and die. It's a rather anticlimactic ending.
I was thinking about that.
Potentially divine being.
Yeah, because you did mention that 1 or 2 episodes ago. And you run into a problem when you talk about that, because the scriptures say that man was created in the image of God.
Right.
Which means that our bodies, according to, Christian beliefs, our bodies are just like God's body, which means that God's body is also imperfect.
He also has the wind pipe next to the food pipe.
Right.
And he also has an appendix.
But he's supposedly a perfect being.
And a tailbone that definitely does not come from having a tail in previous generations. and webbed fingers and toes.
Right.
You know.
Yeah. Well, the tailbone thing, that's what's that term called? Vestigial organ?
Right.
Vestigial organ?
Yeah.
Yeah, where it's something in our body that we don't need anymore.
Right.
And it can go away. But if you look at images of a human fetus inside the uterus, they have tails.
Yes.
Some of them have little tiny tails, the tailbone. And then as the child continues to develop, that goes away.
And every now and then you even get an adult that has where that's protruded, and it's like they have a slight tail.
Yes. Yes. Occasionally that will happen.
Right.
And, it's interesting. Again,
Yeah,
that's a
it
lot
is.
more science that you can learn about if you actually want to learn about science. There's fascinating stuff out there. But, again, going back to it, is that if you say that men and women are made in the image of God, then that means that God's image is not perfect. It's flawed.
Especially if he looks like me. So it's definitely not doing great. I hope God, if he exists, is better than like a solid 7. Where I think I looked at my best like in high school.
We hope he's more like Channing Tatum or
Right.
like WWE wrestlers.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So all right. So let's now.
So the argument from design. That's where we left off.
That's right. So now let's take observation and science, and let's just get rid of all of that, and let's go full on into philosophy, which does not, really try to observe anything. It likes to use logic games to will things into existence. And that's where it's going to lead us to the ontological argument, which is definitely not anything I ever heard of growing
Nope.
up in the Mormon faith.
Not at all.
This
I
is-
had to go through this. When I read this this section, I had to go through it slowly. I had to read it like 2 or 3 times just to pick up what he was talking about.
I had to watch videos that were like simplifying it as best as it could, because to me it just seemed completely insane. And
And it's brand new.
right, it's brand new to us. But I think if you're in those highfalutin intellectual circles, then this is something that's talked about a lot. So here, this is how Dawkins describes it. So this comes from St. Anselm, right? This is... it's,
Saint Anselm of Canterbury in
Yes.
the year 1078.
Right. So it is possible to conceive of a being than which nothing greater can be conceived. Okay, so think of the best thing ever. Even an atheist can conceive of such a superlative being, though he would deny its existence in the real world. But goes the argument, and this is the key. A being that doesn't exist in the real world is by that very fact less than perfect. Therefore we have a contradiction, and hey presto, God exists. So, okay, if something is going to be the greatest thing ever, then according to Anselm, it has to exist in order to be at its maximally great potential. And so that thing, therefore, must exist. Therefore, God exists.
He goes on to say, he says, let me translate this infantile argument into the appropriate language.
Should we
which is
do the 2
language-
voices ourselves?
Sure. Which is the language of the playground.
So I'll start. Bet you I can prove God exists.
Bet you can't.
That's good.
Thanks.
Right then, imagine the most perfect thing possible.
Okay, now what?
Now, is that perfect thing real? Does it exist?
No, it's only in my mind.
But if it was real, it would be even more perfect, because a really perfect thing would have to be better than a silly old imaginary thing. So, I proved that God exists. No, all atheists are fools.
There we go.
I got to listen to the audiobook version of this, and
Oh, yeah.
I forget what the name of the lady is that reads this with him. But they go back and forth. And
Oh, he narrates it himself?
yeah, he narrates it himself, but he also narrates it with, I want to say, his wife at the time.
It's probably his wife, yeah.
Yeah. I forget what her name
Yeah,
is, but
in the beginning of the book, he mentioned that when he was writing this, she read the whole thing out loud to him twice.
yes.
Just so he could hear how it sounded and hear if it sounded right. So yeah, it's probably his wife.
Probably. So they do a great job reading this together, and they bounce back and forth between reading various sections. And so whenever there's like a conversation like that, they do this together.
Nice.
So it's really good. Okay. So I thought that was pretty crazy. So I had to go further on and learn about the modal ontological argument, which basically is a more defined way of saying kind of the same thing.
So it's basically that the most perfect thing has to be real.
Right. Otherwise, it could not be maximally perfect.
That makes no sense.
So,
In reality, shouldn't it be the opposite? That you can't ever have something that's perfect.
well, you see,
That only exists in your mind. It only exists, outside of reality.
I like the counterpoint later on that basically says, why is existing all that great? Because think of it this way, right? You always hear of somebody saying, like, I could beat that guy with one arm tied behind my back, right? Mm-hmm. So why is that impressive? Because he can now win with an arm short, right? So he can win if he has a handicap. So that guy is better than the other guy because he can win even with the handicap, right? Mm-hmm. So if we give somebody more handicaps, they can be even more potentially great. So
if they can in fact do it, yes.
So if God doesn't exist, that would be the ultimate handicap, wouldn't it?
Yeah?
Yeah. So if God creates the entire universe and he doesn't exist, that's even better.
No!
So God definitely didn't create the universe because he doesn't exist, and that's what makes him great.
Oh, gosh.
So, yeah, at this point, our listeners are bleeding through the nose trying to understand this, What I really do think is just sort of a self-important, pretentious argument, right? I think it's like the philosopher's equivalent to like a Jackson Pollock painting, where like you show up there in your beret and your turtleneck, and you pontificate about this deeper meaning of what ultimately results in a smattering of paint, right? And you just so that you can sort of feel awesome.
And then if other people start to validate your point of view, then you feel even more awesome. And like, maybe you're right. Because Jackson Pollock's paintings wouldn't have been popular unless art people said they were amazing.
Right. And
because really, a child can paint those the way he painted. But because artistic people in the field said that, oh, this is amazing, this is incredible, it's groundbreaking, then, it came to have that title. So it's kind of like this. If people, philosophers or people who come up with these arguments, they may not make sense. But if enough people say, oh, it's so deep, like, that was incredible, you've got a really good point there, then it starts to catch on, even though it still doesn't really make sense.
Right.
You do have that debate coming up where you will be discussing all this stuff with, is he a philosophy professor? Or
yes.
Psychology? Philosophy.
Yeah. Yeah, right. Philosophy professor. So exactly. So he'll be doing this argument most likely. And so I'm just trying to learn how to speak the language, right?
Yeah, you want to be familiar with what he's likely going to bring up.
So I'm sure that he's got 10 more responses for anything I've just said. So I can't, and it is not really my goal to argue philosophy, because first of all, my opinion of philosophy is not that high. And secondly, because I want to believe in the observable universe, not of the thinking about universe, right? So if the scientist looks at the universe and goes, here's what is. And that is not what the philosopher necessarily does. Okay. Yeah. In fact, Richard Dawkins calls this whole thing dialectical prestidigitation, which I think is an apt way of putting it. Okay. So, argument for incomplete devastation. A plane crashed, killing 143 passengers and crew, but one child survived with only third-degree burns. Therefore, God exists.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
Excuse me. Background really quick for this one. He says that he's met many wonderful proofs collected at godlessgeeks.com. A richly comic numbered list of over 300 proofs of God's existence. Yes. And so he says, here's a hilarious half dozen, beginning with proof number 36.
Right. And that was the one I just read about something bad happens and somehow this person survived, so therefore God exists.
Therefore God exists and God is good.
Even though the Holocaust happened and he didn't save everybody, so.
But some people survived, so
I think it's just one of those things. It's like very sort of self-important and vain, where you're just like, like people will say stuff like, I found my keys after I prayed. It's like, what the hell, man? Like, honestly, how can you be so self-absorbed to say that God intervened for you to find your stupid keys, but didn't intervene in real tragedy.
Exactly. Yeah. It's self-importance. It's also...
It's narcissism.
Yes, thank you. Yeah. It's narcissism, but it's also a desire to prove to yourself that the God you believe in is a personal God.
Yeah.
That, I think it's less narcissism, but probably more a desire to prove to yourself that your personal God does indeed exist. Because look what he's done for you personally.
Yeah.
Even though, no, there are other explanations for how you found your keys. There are other explanations for how you got that perfect parking spot in the parking lot at the mall during Christmas time.
That's right.
There
was
are other
just one toy left,
Right. And you got it. Yeah. There are other reasons why things happen the way they do.
Right.
It's not God changing physics to benefit you personally. I think it's more wishful thinking.
Oh, definitely. And I think it's also just trying to place yourself at the center of the universe because, of course, we are the most concerned with us. You might say we're even ruled by a selfish gene that uses its survival machine called a body in order to perpetuate those genes.
There you go.
So it makes sense that you would sort of invent a God who runs a show around you, which I think is a very sort of indirect way of making yourself into God. But anyway,
Mormons teach that that's going to happen eventually anyway, so might as well start practicing now.
Well, and this is one part where I say maybe Mormons make a little bit more sense than mainstream Christians because, what is the point of existence, right? Is it really that we're supposed to get through life and then go sit on a cloud and sing about how great Jesus is? At least in Mormonism, they're like, no, you're going to go like make shit, You're going to, play space Minecraft for all eternity. And that's pretty great, That's definitely better than just going around, wow, Jesus, you're so cool. You think even at a certain point, Jesus himself would be like, yeah, all right, man, I got it. Thanks.
Well, I think there are some, their version, even Mormon version, but, that makes God a very narcissistic person.
Yeah.
That I created all these beings so they can worship me.
I know.
That's extremely narcissistic.
Extremely.
But at least maybe that's what, maybe that's part of the selling point of Mormonism. It's, if you talk to other Christians, the idea that God used to be human just like us is blasphemy.
Right. It's
The
offensive.
idea that you can become God is blasphemy.
Yeah, and it's super narcissistic, right?
To them, yes. But for Mormons, it's like, it makes sense. It means that there's more of a purpose. And, just the idea that you're not going to be sitting around worshiping at the feet of God or at the feet of Jesus. You're not going to be singing his praises day and night. You're going to be, busy having a lot of sex because, the idea is that you can continue to have children after, in exaltation. So you got to get going repopulating that new world of yours.
That's my favorite thing about Mormonism. And the thing I miss most about believing, because there was a while there where I thought, I'm going to have my wife forever, plus I'm going to have extra women.
Yes, because there's a Mormon myth that women are more righteous than men. And so in the celestial kingdom, there will be more women than men. But in the celestial kingdom, in exaltation, you have to be married. And
That's
so
right.
the men who are there are going to have to make the sacrifice to take on other wives so that they can have the blessings of exaltation too.
Also,
Polygamy is alive and well in Mormonism. They don't currently practice it here on Earth, but it's absolutely still part of the doctrine for the afterlife.
at least not for mainstream Mormons. Because there are other subsets of Mormons that still...
Yes, there's the fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They broke off from the main religion. They still actively practice polygamy.
Right.
It is officially discontinued in the Mormon Church, the standard Mormon Church.
But the laws of exaltation and end of polygamy still existed with a mainstream Mormon doctrine.
Yes.
And so...
and that was your favorite part?
Oh, definitely. I mean, why wouldn't it be, right? From my very animal brain that exists now, particularly when I was like 19, 20 years old.
Yeah.
Literally, I had one thing on the mind, right? Despite my efforts to not have it be there.
Right.
And the idea that this occurs after everybody's resurrected and everyone has a perfect body. No, that's
perfected body.
Right. It's just fine. Like, you got a little bit of a hook nose. There's nothing wrong with that, man. I'm like your hips are a little smaller, a little wider. Screw it, man. Everybody's beautiful. Let's go for it, man. Mm-hmm. Let's do it. That's so, of course that's attractive.
For the guys.
I knew this, I didn't know him, but there's this Muslim guy I was talking to when I was on my mission. And he's like, hey, you Mormons, you used to practice polygamy, right? And I was like, yeah, we used to do that. We don't do that anymore. And then he said, that's what's wrong with you guys. You should have kept that because we kept that and it's awesome. I'm just like, all right. It's
awesome for the guys. It usually is not for the women.
Right. Yeah. I would assume it's not. But
no.
See, as a guy, like, I wasn't really thinking too much about that.
It's quite appealing. Yeah. I can see that.
So, yeah, sorry. Okay. But if you want to pull your society out of the gutter and you want to make real social progress, Richard Dawkins has said in other interviews, the main thing, actually, I think it might have been Hitchens, but anyway, they said the first thing you need to do is empower your women. So.
Nice.
So some of these other fun arguments were, if things had been different, then things would be different. That would be bad. Therefore, God exists. Argument from sheer will. I do believe in God. I do believe in God. I do believe in God. Therefore, God exists. The majority of the world's population are non-believers in Christianity. That's just what Satan intended. Therefore, God exists. Person X died an atheist. He now realizes his mistake. Therefore, God exists. God loves you. How could you be so heartless as to not believe in him? Therefore, God exists.
The argument from emotional blackmail.
Right.
That's what he calls it.
This is something I felt like I heard growing up.
Yeah, that's in the Mormon Church. They teach God does exist, and he's hurt by those who don't believe in him. He's hurt by those who disobey his commandments.
All right, Jesus
it's
Christ.
Definitely. That was it. Jesus Christ suffered for your sins on the cross.
Right.
Extremely guilt-inducing.
Yeah, it's emotional blackmail.
And it's said all the time. You know, very casually. I honestly don't think members of the church realize the effect of what they're saying. They say it all the time, so they're used to it. It's commonly said. There's nothing shocking about it. But if you really, really stop to think about it, think about what you're doing. It is emotional blackmail. It is guilt-tripping people into behaving properly.
Yeah. Which works great on children, as I understand. So.
Yeah. Yeah, it does.
Yeah. All right. So there's a bunch of other arguments here.
Mm-hmm. The argument from beauty.
That's right. So you're probably the best one to talk about this part.
Oh. It says, so it's the idea that beautiful things exist in the world because God created them. You know, an example that he gives here is the works of Michelangelo, the works of Beethoven, the works of Mozart. You know, it's that, how do you account for these things? And he says, the argument will be so familiar, I needn't document it further. But the logic behind it is never spelled out. And the more you think about it, the more vacuous you realize it to be. Right. Vacuous meaning vacant. Obviously, Beethoven's late quartets are sublime. So are Shakespeare's sonnets. They are sublime if God is there, and they are sublime if he isn't. They don't prove the existence of God. They prove the existence of Beethoven and Shakespeare. Where did he say it? He said that he thinks it's more perhaps jealousy.
Yeah, it's at the very end of the sections. He says, "How dare another human being make such beautiful music, poetry, and art when I can't? It must be God that did it."
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So it doesn't account for genius.
Right. And there are geniuses out there. You know, Mozart was brilliant. His father worked him very hard, you know, taskmaster, seriously. Right. But Mozart had incredible talent. So did Beethoven. You know, back in the Shakespeare's day, his plays were considered bawdy, you know, for the common people. Right. But, you know, if you read the sonnets, if you read just beautiful poems, you know, truly works of art, you think, you know, wow, that's brilliant. You know, the people's minds who create those things, it's their brain. Their brain was, it grew, it developed in such a way that they're capable of these things. It's fantastic. It's not because God blessed them with talent. It's just, that's how they grew. Their brain developed that way. It's fascinating, but it doesn't mean God exists. It doesn't mean he made them that way.
No. They
just are.
Because then I think you have to make God responsible for all the ugly things that exist as well.
That's true. That's true. And that's something that believers in God don't like to face. You know, they want to say that God is responsible for all the beauty in the world. But they don't want to say he's responsible for all the ugliness too. Right. And you can't have it both ways. If God is the creator of the world, then he's responsible for the good and the bad.
Yeah.
Or he's not responsible for any of it.
Right. Well, of course
that's a deist argument where there is a God, but he's not a personal God. He just, you know, kick-started the petri dish of the world and just let it go.
Yeah. And maybe he's taking notes on how it's going.
Right.
You know, he's basically Vault Tech from the Fallout series, right? I just create a series of experiments and I occasionally check on them. So the next section is I would say the Mormon favorite, which is the argument from personal experience.
Yes.
Now, Mormons would take it a step further and say it's personal revelation, right? You have to get this response to something you're doing, in this case, reading the Book of Mormon, praying about it.
Yeah.
What this section is more talking about, I would say, is, you know, those strange occurrences that happen in your life that you can't explain. And I hear that from DS all the time, right? Like just too much has happened in my life that I just can't explain away. Of course, that's also an argument from personal incredulity. If you can't understand something, then it must not be true, or in this case, it must prove the existence of God. But one thing that Dawkins does a really good job of explaining here is that what we perceive is not actually what's happening. What we perceive is a brain simulation of what's happening, right? What we see, what we hear, what we smell, these are interpretations that the brain gives us, not necessarily 100% of what's literally occurring around us. For instance, we can't see the infrared spectrum, right?
Right. Or the ultraviolet on the other end.
Right, exactly. But they exist, right?
Yep.
So, he gives the example right in the beginning of this devil bird. Did we talk about this last week?
We did. The Manx shearwater. Yeah.
Oh my God.
And so I looked it up again, and the Manx shearwater is, I believe it's in Europe. The bird that's nicknamed the devil bird, that's in Sri Lanka. So, but there are different birds throughout the world. So yeah, I put those two together, but they're not. The Manx shearwater does not have the devil bird nickname. It's the devil bird is some kind of an owl.
Oh.
Yeah, it's an owl in Sri Lanka. There's a few different species on the island, but the devil bird's one of them. But there are different birds around the world where they sound almost human, almost like a strangled voice. So it can be kind of creepy. I think the devil bird in Sri Lanka is a little more creepy than the Manx shearwater. But, yeah. So it was the Scottish Isles. That's where the Manx shearwater is.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which I think is where this thing occurred, right? This experience that his friend had.
Yes. Yeah, it was the Scottish Isles.
Right. So
Manx shearwater.
He also goes on to talk about his own experiences, hearing essentially the wind and his brain essentially trying to make sense of something that sounded vaguely like a voice and trying to translate it into words.
Yes.
Right?
He was a child. He was a child when that happened. And so it sounded like a voice. It sounded like a man speaking. Some children would be scared and they would stay in their bed, but he was curious enough of a child that he got up and he actually wanted to find the source of it. And it was the wind blowing through a keyhole. Mm-hmm. Yeah. He also says that the simulation software in the brain is especially adept at constructing faces and voices. Yes. And you see that sometimes, if you're laying on your bed looking up at the ceiling, if you've got the popcorn ceiling, sometimes you can see designs and stuff in it, and sometimes you'll see what looks like a face.
Yes.
Our brain is very good at doing that for us.
Particularly when you're in low light, right? When you can just barely
shadows.
See things. So he talks about a face that he constructed when he was a child made out of like drapes.
Yeah, he saw what looked like a very menacing face.
That's right.
Yeah. On another occasion, this is on page 91. On another occasion, when I was about the same age, so I think he was 7 or 10, somewhere around there, I saw a giant round face gazing with unspeakable malevolence out through the window of an otherwise ordinary house in a seaside village. He says, in trepidation, I approached until I was close enough to see what it really was. Just a vaguely face-like pattern created by the chance fall of the curtains. Yeah, the face itself, in its evil mien, had been constructed in my fearful child's brain. Mm-hmm. And then he goes on to say, on 11th of September 2001, so the Twin Towers attack, pious people thought they saw the face of Satan in the smoke rising from the Twin Towers.
Right,
A superstition backed by a photograph, which was published on the internet and widely circulated.
Which is, something similar to what people experience when they see the Virgin Mary or a picture of Jesus.
Yes.
In like toast.
Right.
Or other objects.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to find something or you've been trained to think a certain way, you can find images where you think you can see them.
Yes. Yep. And there are quite a few more arguments, and we'll try our best to cover them, but it won't take so long.
So this section is called the argument from Scripture, and it mainly talks about the Bible, not any other form of Scripture. And it talks in the beginning about who Jesus was, and points out that there is some question as to whether or not he was divine, and whether or not he even existed. Though Dawkins errs on the idea that he did exist.
Yeah, he probably did exist, but there's a chance that he might have been mistaken in that he was, the Son of God. And
Right.
C.S. Lewis, in the very beginning of the section, he says, C.S. Lewis states that since Jesus claimed to be the Son of God, he must have been either right or else insane or a liar, i.e., mad, bad, or God.
Right.
Or, with artless alliteration, lunatic, liar, or Lord. And then Richard Dawkins says there's a fourth possibility, that Jesus was honestly mistaken.
And that happens to the best of us, sometimes you're just going through your day and they're like, maybe I'm the Messiah. Hold up. And then my wife is like, you're not the Messiah, dear. And I'm like, oh yeah, of course. Sorry.
My mistake.
My mistake. And she just rolls her eyes at me and, calls me a big oaf or whatever. So, it happens. It happens. Why do we buy this sort of thing? Well, Dawkins points out that, we should ask ourselves critical thinking questions whenever we're reading, a piece of nonfiction, right? And he does that. Well, for me, it's on the next page. I mean, depending on what version of this book you have.
For me, it's page 93.
For me, it's page 118. So really, it just depends on which publishing you're reading. But it says,
right.
The fact that something is written down is persuasive to people not used to asking questions like, who wrote it? And when? How did they know what to write? Did they, in their time, really mean what we, in our time, understand them to be saying? Were they unbiased observers? Or did they have an agenda that colored their writing? And luckily today we don't have anyone who has an agenda that colors their writing anymore. So that's very handy. Oh, wait, no, the opposite of that is true. Okay.
Right. And I wrote in the margin, misquoting Jesus, the story behind who changed the Bible and why. And I believe I've mentioned that book before, where in fact I did. He's a biblical scholar, and he goes through and he points out areas where the text has changed from the earliest manuscripts that we have. And he ascribes, some of these arguments. For example, just really quick, in the Bible, where Paul says that women are to learn in silence. Essentially, learn in silence. They're not to, usurp authority over a man? Something like that. He says that there's no evidence that was in the original text. That was likely added either by the scholars themselves or by the people who were talking about that issue during that time. And they put it in the scriptures as a way to solve that problem.
Right. So on top of that, of course, these things are written long after the death of Jesus.
Correct.
Right. So the timing, I can't remember what I had for breakfast, 2 days ago, much less, stuff several decades later. So all were copied and recopied. He talks about apocryphal books, such as the Gospel of Thomas or of Judas, and talks about how they don't make the cut.
And likely why. Because
why.
the stories in them about Jesus are just a little too off the wall. Like, no one's going to believe this. It's a little too much even for us.
Yeah. So, for example, in the Gospel of Thomas, he describes Jesus as using his magical powers to, do little lovable, mischievous things, such as make his dad's carpentry job easier and turning his playmates into goats.
Yep.
So that's pretty fun. The Gospel of Judas. I don't remember if that was in this book or if it was in a different book. But that talks about Jesus telling Judas that this is what he wants him to do.
I think that might have been in another.
That might have been in the Selfish Gene, or maybe God's Not Great. I forget where it was, but but they talk about that. He does
mention the Gospel of Thomas in this book.
Yeah, he does.
Yep. He also talks about how the stories in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and I think John as well,
right,
they don't match up.
Right. So one specific example he gives is the lineage of Joseph, the stepdad of Jesus, because they have different numbers of descendants leading up to, or ascendants, I guess I should say, ancestors, leading up to, David. And then the names are not even close to the same. Mm-hmm. Now, I have read up a little further on this, and biblical scholars give, I don't know if they're scholars, but websites I've read have basically, explained that away, saying that one was dealing with like Mary's lineage, but in both passages it refers directly to Joseph, so I don't know where they're getting that. On top of that, why would they have a vastly different number of ancestors? Because it's like one's like double the other.
Oh gosh.
So
it sounds like they're trying to justify this obvious error.
Right. It sounds like rationalizing, right?
Yeah. Another one that Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, that's the story of Jesus' birth, where he was born.
Right, and
that's different too.
I love how he talks about how weird it is 1,000 years later, you're asked to go back to the birthplace of your distant ancestor to be taxed. Like it makes it's totally insane.
Yeah.
Right. Like, why would you do that? Why would, the president call on you, Lisa, to go back to wherever your ancestor came from 1,000 years ago to get taxed there? Right.
Yeah. And he said that, there was a tax, but it was a local tax. It wasn't by Caesar Augustus. It was a local census. And he says that people understand why Luke tried to do this because he wanted to make Jesus' story fulfill the prophecy in Micah, in the book of the Old Testament in Micah. And to do that, he had to have Jesus born in, was it Bethlehem?
In Bethlehem, right? Because
and so that's how Luke, that is the story he made up to have Jesus born in Bethlehem, was that, Joseph's far, far ancestor used to live there. And Caesar Augustus said, everyone go back to, I guess your parents' hometown to be taxed.
Right.
It's a total stretch, but, they're like, we see why Luke tried to do it, so that Jesus could be that person that was mentioned in the Old Testament. But it just didn't happen that way.
Also they're written differently in order to appeal to different audiences. When you're trying to do missionary work in the future, it's easier to convince the people that you're talking to believe in your God when it more easily matches up with your traditions. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, the whole concept of the virgin birth, is something that, comes from pagan tradition. So
Yes.
all of the legends of Jesus's birth are actually recycled from different, cultures from before that time.
Yeah.
Right. So the example he gives is Matthew's desire to fulfill messianic prophecies, the descent from David, the birth in Bethlehem, were to benefit Jewish readers, right? Whereas Luke wants to adapt Christianity for the Gentiles, and so it has virgin birth, worship by kings, and that sort of thing. And they end up contradicting. So,
Yep, they do.
let's see.
Yeah. So just the basic overall argument of this section is that the scriptures are not a reliable source of factual historical information.
Right.
The four gospels, probably the most, easily known of all the gospels because they're first. When people start to read the New Testament, those are the ones they come across. Their stories don't match up. They factually contradict themselves. And so you can't rely on them as a source of divine truth.
On top of that, the Bible itself has been translated and retranslated many, many times, either on accident or trying to fix earlier problems, or in order to better fit your narrative that you're selling, whatever it is. So a lot of times you can't even argue, if you're in a religious debate, what Bible you should even be using.
Yeah. And Mormons use the King James Version of the Bible. And
English-speaking Mormons.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. English-speaking Mormons use the King James Version of the Bible. And the church leaders in the past have said this is the most correct version of all the versions out there, which is actually incorrect. And that's something that that's found in Misquoting Jesus. In that book, he goes over a few of the different versions of the Bible, and the King James Version is not that accurate. It's very poorly done compared to some other versions.
I think one of the examples that they give is that in not all versions of the Bible is Mary necessarily a virgin.
Oh, really?
But that she's like a young maid. And they're like, well, think about it in English, right? We have words like maid and maiden, right?
Yes.
And they can mean different things, and it could be very confusing to someone who's not intimately familiar with English, right?
And that's another that's another reason why some Bible versions contradict each other, and why some passages in the same Bible contradict each other. It could be due to mistranslation.
Right.
Some words in the original text are very close to each other, and it's quite possible that scholars read one word and thought it was a different word, because of like one letter change, that kind of thing.
It kind of finishes off with this great quote by Thomas Jefferson that he wrote to John Adams. And he says, "The day will come when the mystical generation of Jesus by the Supreme Being as his Father in the womb of a virgin will be classed with the fable of the generation of Minerva in the brain of Jupiter." Mm-hmm. Right. And I can remember people in France telling me that. They're like, one of these days, no one's going to believe in this stuff anymore.
Yeah.
And my witty comeback was, yes, huh? So.
Yeah.
Okay, so the next section is the argument from admired religious scientists.
Yep.
Opens up with a Bertrand Russell quote, which is, "The immense majority of intellectually eminent men disbelieve in Christian religion, but they conceal the fact in public because they are afraid of losing their incomes."
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In America, that's very much the case. And you can tell with comedy. On YouTube you can find, comics joking about Jesus, about how, basically how religious belief is kind of silly. And they've noticed that over in Europe, in England, you can joke about that stuff. People are used to it. But you do those same jokes here in America, people get seriously offended. And, comics are like, what, really? But yeah, here in the U.S., and that's something that this section points out, is just how much of what percentage of the population is religious versus what percentage of their intellectuals are religious or atheist. Most intellectuals, scientists especially, are atheist. And the vast majority of the American public is religious.
That, of course, doesn't prove that they're right. We
No.
can't appeal to majority in order to say that one claim is right or not.
Mm-hmm.
However, it is a bit suspect. I would probably think twice about it, right?
Yeah.
Of course, I say that as a libertarian, right? I'm definitely not in the majority of anything in that case.
As a libertarian atheist, no.
Right? Yeah, I'm not. Yeah,
a very,
exactly.
very small minority.
Right.
Yeah. I believe that's actually the appeal to authority. Isn't that a logical fallacy?
Yeah, appeal to authority and the bandwagon fallacy. They're both, fairly close together. But if I go into this debate and I say, well, Richard Dawkins says that this, technically that would be, a fallacy because, if I try to say that it's right because Richard Dawkins says it,
mm-hmm.
and I know it's true because he's a scientist, then that would be appealing to authority.
Yeah.
Now, that's not to say that you should not read up on authorities and that you shouldn't test ideas and that you shouldn't compare them with, logic or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
Authorities are authorities for a reason.
Yeah.
However, it does not prove on its own face that it's correct.
Yeah. I would say that this section right here, I think that the LDS community does this a lot. Admired religious scientists. So the current prophet is Russell M. Nelson, and he used to be a surgeon, and he gave that up when he became an apostle of the church.
Right.
A lot of the leaders have had prominent jobs, prominent careers, some of them in the medical field.
Many of them have been in the medical field.
Yes. And it's easy for members to look up to them and to believe what they say because before they became apostles, they had valid, credible jobs that were prestigious. And it's very easy as a member of the church to say, my leaders say that they know Jesus is the Christ, that they know he lived, that he died for our sins. We know that. So even if just myself as just a regular member of the church, if I'm having doubts, at least I can look to my leaders and believe them until I can believe it for myself, until I get that personal revelation that God is real, that, this church is true. Until that happens, I can rely on my leaders because they say they know. They're the leaders of the church for a reason. They're God's chosen leaders, and so I can believe them.
And why would they lie? What could they possibly have to gain?
Exactly. Why would they lie?
They're such kindly old men, right? There's no way that.
Yeah.
And I listened to a podcast. I think it was on Seth Andrews' show, The Thinking Atheist, where they talk about how otherwise really intelligent people can believe in really insane stuff. And I thought it was really interesting, but I think we could apply that C.S. Lewis question, to the church leaders as well. You could apply it to the Pope. Are they lying? Are they insane? Are they mistaken?
Mm-hmm.
Which is it? And I'm not sure. I'm not sure that answer would be the same for all of them.
No. Sometimes I look at the leaders of the church and I'm like, some of them probably absolutely believe that what they're saying is true. Some of them absolutely believe that they're receiving personal revelation from God for the church. Others, it's quite possible they have doubts. they're never going to come out and say it. Can you imagine that? If in General Conference, one of the 12 apostles came to the podium and said, you know what, guys?
We made
It's
it
not
up.
true.
We made it up, you know.
I've done more research into church history the past few years than I've ever done in my life, and I've come to the conclusion that this church is not true.
I went to the special witnesses meeting. They all told me what the hoedown was, and I decided not to play ball. All right.
Yeah.
You know, whatever it is, you know, who knows? Or they just, you know, when I look at a guy like Eyring, I feel like he legit thinks it's happening. You know, and I can't say for sure. But I don't necessarily get that feeling with all of them.
No.
So and I could be totally wrong. Who knows? But
and that's the thing, you know, they're the only ones who know what they're thinking. But there's a good chance that some people in the higher positions of the church don't believe it anymore. But they're not going to tell because they don't want to ruin the happiness that they think the church brings to their congregation members.
So if someone's lying, I don't necessarily think it's for personal gain, although that can certainly be a factor. You know,
the church pays their salary.
It may very well be this is what the world needs, right? Or this is what my community needs, right?
Yeah.
You know, the belief that humans can't get by without divine order, right? That if we all became atheists, we'd all, you know, kill each other, right? It's the same argument people give against libertarianism, right? If we weaken the government too much, then it'll all just be warlords.
Yeah.
Right. And so
society will descend into chaos.
Yeah, society will descend into chaos. Well, it's the same sort of argument about religion. And then the rest of the chapter kind of goes in with various counter arguments and other examples. I think we should move on, though, to Pascal's wager in the next section.
Yes.
So Pascal's wager, you've probably all heard it in one form or another. But essentially, if you believe in God, then that's a pretty safe bet, because if you die, nothing happens. You didn't lose anything. But if you die and it is true and you didn't believe it, then you're in trouble. Right? And if you die and you did believe it, and it is true, then you super won. Right? So it only makes sense from a betting standpoint to believe in God.
Richard Dawkins says, Pascal's wager could only ever be an argument for feigning belief in God.
Right. You can't actually do it.
Right. And the God that you claim to believe in had better not be of the omniscient kind, or he'd see through the deception.
Right.
So it's the idea, you know, like, well, if, you know, you should believe in God, but at the same time, it's like, well, I could say I believe in God, but he would know that I'm lying.
Right, yeah, because you can say you believe, but whether or not you truly do believe, or is a different thing.
Yeah.
Right, which is why John Locke says that, you cannot compel others into belief, right? Like, even if we were to enforce a single religion by the sword, it would not mean that anyone believed it. So, in fact, kind of going back to the other chapter a little bit, they say, well, what about these, ancient, mathematicians, or not ancient, but, Renaissance era mathematicians and philosophers and that sort of thing. They're all Christians. It's like, well, yeah, but I mean, it's not like it was an option.
Yeah.
Right? Like, whether or not they actually believed it, is certainly up for debate.
Yeah, but they had to say they did. There was practically no choice.
Yeah, hence the Bertrand Russell quote.
Yeah. When society's run by the Catholic Church, you can't come out and say, this is crap. I mean, look what happened to Galileo. He got in serious trouble when he, showed that, the Earth is probably actually not the center of the universe. The sun doesn't revolve around us.
And this is one of the reasons why I resent the idea that that being an atheist is somehow taking the easy way out, which is something that I've been told and that I've had to argue against. it's just, it's a lot harder to believe in God. No, it's not. No, it's not. Not from like a social perspective. It's much harder to go up to your loved ones who you're about to super disappoint and to tell them, hey, I don't believe this anymore. It takes a lot more courage for a guy like Galileo to hold on to his beliefs, even though it was, suicide for him, both economically and in real life.
Yeah.
How much easier would it have been to just say, okay, yeah, sure. And then to just keep your beliefs to yourself. I think that's what a lot of us would have done, right? Like if there's a Taliban takeover of America, you might consider just saying, yeah, sure, Allah, whatever. But deep inside, you don't believe that shit. I like how later on he talks about the reverse Pascal's wager. So he says, is it possible finally to argue for a sort of anti-Pascal wager? Suppose that we grant that there is indeed some small chance that God exists. Nevertheless, it could be said that you will lead a better, fuller life if you bet on his not existing than if you bet on his existing, and therefore squander your precious time on worshiping him, sacrificing to him, fighting and dying for him, etc. And I think, at least personally, and you can feel free to disagree with me, but I don't think you will. But I will say personally that I feel like I'm getting a lot more out of life without having to blow 3 hours on Sunday.
No, it's not just 3 hours on Sunday.
No, it's not.
It's Relief Society meetings. It's, for teenagers, it's seminary, early morning seminary for those outside of Utah. It's mutual on the weekdays. You put a lot of time into reading your scriptures, into praying, into doing church activities, into the responsibilities that you're given for your calling at church. You put a lot of time into the church. I'm speaking from an ex-Mormon point of view.
Oh, yeah. You put in a ton of time. I mean, you can almost be a second job.
Yeah.
And if you're something like a bishop, it's probably more full-time than your actual full-time job.
Probably. Yeah. Just the basic thing of how much time you have to yourself. That's no reason in itself to leave a church or to stop believing in God, but it's just one of the side effects is you have more time to yourself. You have more time to focus on your passions, focus on hobbies, doing things with your family.
Yeah, well, what do you think? The Sabbath day is supposed to be some kind of family day?
That's why there's family home evening.
That's right, on Monday. Because that's what you want to do as a working parent. Anyway, though, to be fair, guys, even if you're not religious, you probably should try to find a night a week where you spend it with your family, if that's all you can muster. Preferably more than one night. That's just good advice.
Yeah, that is a good thing. It's something that the church semi-mandates, but the LDS church. But, it is a good idea.
It was also semi-mandated in my household. And the way it works is every few months you decide you're going to actually do it for realsies this time. You keep it up for a couple of weeks, and then eventually it dies out.
Yeah.
No, I think...
you start off with good intentions. It just, life gets in the way.
Yeah. No judgment, guys. It was just... I know that's part of it. Same thing with home teaching. This is the month, guys. This is the month. No, it's not. They're kind of like Mormon New Year's, right?
Yeah.
This year I'm going to lose the weight. Nope. Okay, and then the book, the chapter ends with the section called Bayesian Arguments. And basically it just argues that the existence of God is more probable than not.
Yeah. And he goes into... Again, he's talked about it before also, is the probability that God exists. There is currently no way to prove for certain that he is real or that he is not real. But one is more probable than the other. The probability that God does not exist is a lot higher than the probability that he does exist.
Right, but in this argument, they're arguing the opposite, right? That it's that's more probably that it does, but it's based upon a flawed mathematical model.
Yep. And I wrote a few places here in the margins where I was like, LDS. I did that a little bit in the book. Just like reading through, I'm like, this rings a bell from Mormonism. So he says, I've challenged religious but otherwise intelligent scientists to justify their belief, given their admission that there is no evidence. And they say, I admit that there's no evidence. There's a reason why it's called faith.
You're right. As if that were more virtuous.
Yes. And admittedly, people of a theological bent are often chronically incapable of distinguishing that with what is true from what they'd like to be true. But for a more sophisticated believer in some kind of supernatural intelligence, it is childishly easy to overcome the problem of evil. Simply postulate a nasty God, such as the one who stalks every page of the Old Testament. Or, if you don't like that, invent a separate evil God, call him Satan, and blame his cosmic battle against the good God for the evil in the world. Or, a more sophisticated solution, postulate a God with grander things to do than fuss about human distress. And this is the one that goes towards the LDS religion. Or a God who is not indifferent to suffering, but regards it as the price that has to be paid for free will in an orderly, lawful cosmos. So, there's that. If you have a hard time justifying a good, benevolent God, well, come up with these other things.
Right. You can always move your goalposts if you can't score any field goals. Mm-hmm. Right. You can always do that.
Yeah, but it's a stretch. It's a stretch. And then you've got the problem of defining God. You've got some sects of Christianity who are very focused on the fire and brimstone part, the wrath of God. The LDS religion does not focus on that. They focus on a kind, benevolent God who is bound by eternal laws to allow human suffering.
But at the same time, I would not say that they deny the Old Testament God. I think that they root for him just as much as a lot of other Christian sects will do.
Well, the Mormons claim that the Lord of the Old Testament is Jesus.
Indeed.
That it's not even Heavenly Father, that it's Jesus.
That it's Jesus himself, yeah.
Yeah, which is a huge problem. Because look at what Jesus did in the Old Testament.
Yeah, even in the New Testament, he's still not the greatest. We could probably talk about that more, but maybe when we cover Hitchens' God is Not Great, because he does a really good job of going, yeah, we definitely romanticize Jesus a little bit more. And we like to say that, he's this peacenik.
You're projecting your own sense of morality onto Jesus.
Right, what we would like him to be.
Yes, but there's no real hard evidence for that in the scriptures themselves.
But it makes sense that we do that.
Of course.
If you look at polytheistic gods, they're just breaking up your moods and your personality and the different spheres of life into personification. Mm-hmm. Right. And then, with monotheism, we've decided that there's, a preferable one way to be. And so, that being has to reflect those values.
But that makes for a very contradictory person. It makes a lot more sense when you've got, a god of war, a goddess of love, a goddess of fertility, a god of, whatever else there was. I like Greek mythology. It's interesting.
It is interesting. But I think that if, let's say we still believed in like Hades and Ares and Aphrodite today, I think we would still be arguing about exactly who they are and exactly what the quote unquote scriptures would really said about them. We would say, Ares, he really wasn't such a good guy. We'd be like, well, actually, when he said war, what he really meant was, when Aphrodite, had sex with that guy, what it really meant was, or we'd start saying, well, it's not that literal, right? Like, Loki didn't literally turn into a horse and then Thor's horse had sex with him and he became a mother. You know, that's
true. In this scientific
that's allegorical, man.
Yeah. In the scientific age, we would have those discussions. You know, we would see them. It'd be harder to explain the fantastic stories that come from the mythology.
I guarantee anyone listening to this is now looking up that Loki story.
As they should.
Might I suggest Neil Gaiman's Norse mythology is quite good.
Maybe
that should be the next book we read. So.
Yeah. Well, that ends the chapter.
Yeah, and boy howdy, what a chapter that was. But, you know, you could see why we wanted to single it out, I hope, because, gosh, there's just a lot to cover. There's a lot to talk about.
Yeah. So after reading this chapter, how do you feel about the debate coming up?
Yeah,
do you feel a little more prepared?
I feel a little bit more prepared. At the same time, I need to not come at this guy as if I'm some kind of philosopher. I have an art school degree, right? And I should probably, come at it from, just a genuine position of who I am. And my limited knowledge of the universe. And I think that the bigger difference perhaps between the two of us is that I'm fine with the I don't know answer.
Yeah.
Or maybe we'll find out. But at the end of the day, we can define or try to define atheists in many terms. But at the end of the day, the only thing it really believes is that you don't believe in God. Right? Or you at least very highly doubt that a God exists.
Yeah.
And on Dawkins scale, I'm probably like a 6.5, right? Like, I'm pretty dang sure there's no God. And if there is one, I don't think he's the one in the Bible.
Yeah. Or even if he is he worth worshiping?
Right.
My answer to that is no. Even if the God of the Old Testament, whether he be Heavenly Father or Jesus Christ, whatever, I don't know, I don't care. That
Right.
God is not, to me, that's not someone I want to worship. The God of the Old Testament is a God of war. I don't worship that. That's not something I value.
Yeah, but again, when we read God is not great, we'll get real into that discussion.
Yeah, looking forward to it.
So I know next week we want to talk about the LDS General Conference, but I also want to make sure that the libertarian side of this podcast is being touched on.
Yes, absolutely. And the reason why we're covering the General Conference is because, again, that happened this weekend, Saturday and today, Sunday. So I want to discuss current events while they're still current.
Indeed. We'll have to keep that at least somewhat brief.
Yes.
But we'll pick out a couple of good articles for us to read, maybe post them online, and so that other people have a chance to comment and put in their 2 cents. But yeah, we'll definitely talk about those. As far as the next book goes, I suggest kind of doing something a little bit more political.
Yes.
I really like Basic Economics by Thomas Sowell. That one's really good. I am interested in going back through 12 Rules for Life by Jordan Peterson. That's not exactly libertarian.
No, it's more pro-religion.
So I think there's something there, especially in today's discourse. We could do, what do I have here? We could do,
What's a book on your list that's, pretty solid libertarian?
So
would that be something by Ron Paul?
Yeah, Ron Paul would be good. So you have End the Fed. That one's pretty good. There's The Road to Serfdom by Hayek. It's almost impossible to get away from a reading of economics when it comes to arguing for libertarianism. Because socially we largely agree with the left, except for perhaps when it comes to guns. Ultimately we believe in a lot of personal freedom. The Road to Serfdom is a good one, but it's a bit crunchy. The America's Great Depression is really good. That's by Murray Rothbard, and that would make the ANCAPs a little bit fun, or more happy, I should say.
Okay.
And then, there was another book that I truly loved, and it was something that was really good for me in the beginning of my journey into libertarianism, which is actually by Walter Block, and it's called Defending the Undefendable. And it's actually a really fun read because you go through all these different sort of occupations, shall we say, in life that we think are bad, but that actually serve important economic or social purposes. So that might be worth doing if you want to start with something that's not quite so heavy.
Sure.
Otherwise, I would probably say The Road to Serfdom or Basic Economics.
Okay.
Any votes?
Yeah, we'll decide that later.
Okay.
Yeah.